Hi class, this is going to be the video on informed consent, which is, we're just getting the Vaughan kind of introduction, but I will try to add some spots where the controversies arise. But this is a survey course and I want you to be a little bit aware of what's out there, even if we're not going through all the, but several articles on it. Second of all, pay attention at the end of the video. I'm going to do some week 7 logistics stuff to try to help us end the course strong. But for now, let's just dig into the informed consent. It's one of those things that you've heard a lot, but might not have ever really examined or thought about closely. So let's start with Vaughan's definition, which I think is a good one. Informed consent is the action of an autonomous agent inform. Sorry, I'm so used to saying autonomous agent. The action of an autonomous informed person agreeing to submit to medical treatment or experimentation. So this serves a dual role, and we could talk about it differently in different contexts. One role is it's what Vaughan calls a medical ideal. It's the in a perfect world, this would always happen before any type of treatment or experimentation. Obviously, that doesn't. Uh, First of all, think of the cases of weak paternalism we already talked about. Well, it's weak paternalism when someone cannot give informed consent. So children can't really have informed consent, but hopefully their parents do, or at least a guardian ad litem. And there's various ways that people aren't able to choose for themselves, which is when weak paternalism comes in. But in a medically ideal world, in an ethically perfect world, that's what we would always have. That's the ideal we aim for. We don't achieve perfection, but we try to aim for it. But second of all, informed consent is also a legal entity. And so it is generally considered a legal requirement now in the US to do various sorts of things. So uh, this has come up in the 1914 was the Supreme Court decision that kind of required some version of consent. So uh, that's the general idea. Now, what is going to go on with informed consent? Well, first of all, let's talk about what informed consent requires, and there are 5 different things here. So, uh, step one, and these are, by the way, all areas where there's cases where it's clearly met, there's cases where it's clearly not met, and then there's the gray areas in the middle. The difficult parts will be the gray areas. So, the 5 requirements for informed consent. Requirement 1 is that the patient must be competent. Now, we have to be a little careful here because when we're talking about competence, we're talking about competent for this specific decision, able to make the decision about the medical treatment or experiment. They don't have to be competent in every area, which is good because we're not, but just in that area. So, uh, what kind of things would constitute gray areas? A lot of it has to do with what the gray areas in paternalism are. Well, a gray area might be where maybe a patient is starting to get brain symptoms in a disease, but we're not sure how much is very common. Things like that. Requirement 2 is adequate disclosure. The patient is given all the information, the risks, etc. That's probably the least gray area one, is the adequate disclosure, because just tell what's out there. Harder, though, is the third requirement, which is that the patient understands the information. And this is tricky because, well, there's a sense in which, you can have the patient understand all the words, but that's not quite the same as fully understanding, because ultimately, with very few exceptions, the patient doesn't have a medical degree, which means the doctor is dumbing things down for them. And I don't mean in a condescending way. I just mean, well, the doctor's an expert and the patient is not. The information must be translated to make a non-medical professional understand things. And so the biggest gray area there is some people have argued that non-doctors could really never give informed consent by the definition because uh, they cannot reasonably understand step three. And of course, that's been used as an argument for paternalism, but that's also been used for um, waiving consent. Uh, and so someone can waive it and say, look, it's my choice, it's my autonomous choice to choose not to decide, to trust the doctor to do what they're good at. I don't usually give my views too much in this course, but in I won't say that's the direction I go, but ultimately, what I try to do when I'm dealing with professionals, whether it's a doctor or a real estate agent, etc., is find a professional who do all my research, what I'm good at, to find someone who I trust and who is good in their field, and then I can, you know, waive not all my decisions, but there are spots where I'm comfortable saying whatever you think is best. So the full waiver is they do that across the board, but you can simply waive a specific decision as well. And again, that's because there is a genuine worry about if you don't have if somebody who's not a doctor, who hasn't gone to med school, who doesn't understand a lot of these terms and interactions with other parts of the body, is in a position to really understand and make the best decision for themselves. But again, Vaughn points out that's still autonomous. To actively choose to give that up is very differently than the doctor taking it without me saying go ahead. Uh, Speaking of which, that leads us to the fourth requirement, which is that the decision um, is voluntary. So obviously, if the doctor goes, "Mwahaha, I'm treating anyway," makes it not voluntary. But there's much more subtle versions, right? There's coercive ways to violate this requirement, and so if a doctor is coercing with the threat of harm, say, well, I'm going to cut off your pain meds, or even just saying it's going to hurt a whole lot if you don't get this treatment. That's coercion, or manipulation is trying to control without harm. So, roughly speaking, there has to be no coercion, no manipulation. And then, lastly, the fifth requirement is that the patient consents to the treatment. And I like Vaughn's description of the consent here because it means not just saying yes. That's not what consent means. Consent means that the patient accepts the responsibility of their decision. That even if things go poorly, it's something I said yes to, which means I'm the one who is accepting the consequences rather than trying to shunt them, say, to the doctor or the hospital or something like that. So, patient has to be competent. By the way, that's so just we're just summarizing. Has to be competent. Competence is usually presumed unless there's good reason to think otherwise. Has to have adequate disclosure, where they talk about the nature of the procedure, the risk, the alternative, the expected benefit. They have to understand the information, which Vaughn says as assess well enough to appreciate the consequences of the choices. That is not what is meant by understanding. That is a really weak definition, but that's legally that's all that's required. And if you're more interested in your own health, you want to go beyond that. Treatment has to be voluntary in the sense that it avoids coercion or manipulation. And lastly, it has to be consented, which means not just yes, but saying yes to the responsibility. The decision was mine, not the doctor's. And so that's what's required with informed consent. And we've talked a little bit about where some of the gray areas arise. So that's all I want to say for informed consent. I will say next week is week 7. And what happens in week 7? First of all, as I'm sure you've been reminding yourself the whole course, this is an accelerated class, which means we're doing basically 2 1/3 weeks of work per week. But week 7 is actually a half week because of the uh, fall break. And so, first of all, I did half the work. There's only one topic next week with fewer readings, and then there's discussion initial post, but no responses are required. So there's that. But I also want to do it so you have plenty of time to get your Unit 4 paper in before the deadline. The deadlines exist when they do a little earlier than usual because I have to get grades in. And so I can't take it a whole week after the unit's over because that's the day grades are due. So just keep in mind with that and think in terms of, well, maybe just logistically, even if I'm more interested in physician assisted suicide, it might be logistically better to do my paper on paternalism or something like that. Just be very mindful of the deadlines and make your decisions accordingly so as to maximize your own benefit. And as always, I'm here to help. If some of the deadlines are really a problem, then we can go on a case by case basis and see what we can do. I can't just categorically give everybody extra time because again, grade deadlines. Um, in extreme circumstances, incompletes are sometimes available, but don't assume them. And as always, just come talk if something's coming up. Otherwise, I will see you next week.